Germany, February 1944. Late morning. The air is still, cold, gray. A factory whistle screams across the rooftops of a city that has already known too many alarms. Workers spill into the open courtyards, expecting another false warning. Another formation passing somewhere else. But then someone looks up. Faint glimmer. Then another. Sharp, metallic strokes against the sky. The sun catches them, turning their shapes into shining silhouettes. One after another, they emerge from the distant haze, countless silver wings stretching from horizon to horizon. Engines. Not a few, not dozens, hundreds. A deep, rolling thunder builds above the rooftops, rattling windows, shaking dust from beams in the underground shelters below. Children cover their ears. Policemen shout for civilians to move, but their voices are swallowed by the roar. The Germans stare upward in disbelief. The sky is no longer blue. It has turned silver. And in that moment, as more than 1,000 American heavy bombers carve their path directly into the heart of the Reich, every witness understands a simple truth. No one can stop what is coming. War had reshaped the European continent into a fortress of fire and steel. By early 1944, the Third Reich still controlled vast territory, but its confidence had begun to fracture. The Eastern Front consumed German strength daily, and in the Mediterranean, the Allies pressed north through Italy. Yet Hitler and his generals remained certain of one thing: if they could protect their industrial power in the heart of Germany, they could continue the fight. That belief was about to be shattered. Across the Channel, a different kind of war machine had been gathering strength. The United States Army Air Forces, still young when America entered the war in December 1941, matured with a terrifying purpose: to crush Germany's war factories from the sky. Their doctrine diverged sharply from Britain's approach. The RAF focused on nighttime area bombing, accepting that precision in darkness was impossible. They sought to break morale, to burn cities, to force surrender through fear. The Americans believed something else entirely. They promised daylight precision, the destruction of specific factories, oil refineries, transport hubs, and submarine pens. If the Reich lost the means to produce tanks, engines, aircraft, fuel, and weapons, then German soldiers, wherever they stood, would be defeated before they fired a single shot. To deliver such force, the U.S. built the largest strategic bomber fleet the world had ever seen. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, tough, bristling with machine guns, engineered to stay airborne even when torn apart by fire, became the backbone of the campaign. Alongside it flew the consolidated B-24 Liberator, faster and longer ranged, carrying heavier bomb loads into Germany's industrial heart. These aircraft assembled into massive combat box formations. Layers of overlapping guns, hundreds of .50 caliber barrels ready to tear apart interceptors. Every man aboard, gunners, navigators, bombardiers, pilots, trusted that unity in the air was their only shield. Yet the enemy they faced was formidable. Germany had constructed a defensive wall in the sky: radar networks, searchlights, ground controllers, thousands of 88mm anti-aircraft guns positioned around every major industrial target. The Luftwaffe, despite staggering losses in Russia, still fielded experienced fighter pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Over the Reich, even the boldest mission became a crucible. As the U.S. 8th Air Force grew on British soil, its leaders knew daylight bombing would be costly. Raids like Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943 proved the danger: hundreds of bombers lost, thousands of airmen killed, captured, or missing. Missions returned with entire squadrons erased, formation gaps marking where friends once flew. But America could replace planes and train new crews faster than Germany could destroy them. By late 1943, the weight of U.S. industrial power had crossed the Atlantic. More bombers, more trained aircrews, more fuel, more spare parts, more everything. The combined bomber offensive, a coordinated British-American strategy, went into full effect. The goal was audacious: dismantle the German war machine from above, piece by piece. Each month brought bigger raids. Each raid reached deeper into Germany's core. Still, the ultimate barrier remained. Could the Allies smash German air strength itself? That question would be answered in early 1944, when the sky would begin turning silver, and the war inside Germany would enter its most terrifying phase. And with every growing bomber formation over Europe, one truth became impossible to ignore. The real battle for Germany's future was no longer on the ground. It was coming from the sky. As 1944 approached, the Kriegsmarine's U-boat threat in the Atlantic had been beaten back. Hitler's hope of starving Britain failed. Instead, the island fortress had become the most powerful air base on Earth, a giant runway aimed directly at Germany. The combined bomber offensive now intensified with clear strategic objectives: destroy the aviation industry, cripple oil production and fuel supply, collapse transportation networks, force the Luftwaffe into battle and break it. Berlin, Hamburg, Hanover, Leipzig, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, each name became another target on the growing list. Every mission meant sirens screaming through German cities and workers diving for cover as machine shops and factory floors shook under the impact of 500-pound explosives. Inside homes and schools, people carried gas masks. Families slept in basements built into bunkers. Air raid wardens patrolled rooftops. Hospitals marked their roofs with giant red crosses, hoping to be spared. But the bombs kept falling. And with each raid, the German High Command demanded one thing: the Luftwaffe must stop the Americans. Yet the balance had begun to tilt. From airfields stretching across England, airbases like Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, and Kimbolton, the 8th Air Force launched missions that grew in size every week. What began as hundreds soon became formations so large they could stretch across the sky for dozens of miles. Pilots described it as flying inside a city made of airplanes. German observers were alarmed. Intelligence reports warned that more bombers and more trained crews arrived every month. New long-range fighters, especially the sleek P-51 Mustang, were entering combat, threatening to escort bombers deep into German airspace. Until now, U.S. heavy bombers often flew beyond fighter support, making them vulnerable to devastating Luftwaffe attacks. But that window was closing. At the same time, Germany struggled to replace its losses. Aviation plants worked frantically to produce new fighters, but Allied raids increasingly targeted those very factories. Pilots shot down over Germany seldom returned to duty. Every skilled aviator lost was a blow that could not be fully repaired. In Berlin, rocket scientist Albert Speer, now Minister of Armaments, saw the danger clearly. Industrial output was rising despite the bombings, but Germany was approaching a breaking point. One more shift in the air war could make the entire system collapse. Hitler refused to believe it. He ordered cities fortified, flak towers reinforced, and German fighter tactics sharpened. But the enemy had outgrown his expectations. American bomber production surged past 1,500 aircraft every month. Far more than Germany could shoot down. The U.S. goal was no longer simply damaging factories. It was destroying the Luftwaffe itself. The question was when the decisive moment would arrive. When would the Americans finally unleash the full might they had been building? German civilians sensed something enormous was coming. Air raid drills ran non-stop. Children memorized shelter routes. Entire school classes relocated to the countryside to escape the firestorms. And through every sleepless night, one dread persisted. If this continues to grow, what happens when the sky becomes completely full? That answer, that nightmare, would soon become reality. The moment was approaching when 1,000 bombers would fill the air at once, and Germany would learn what true air supremacy looked like. The sky was about to turn silver. For civilians in the Reich, the war in the sky was the most terrifying war of all. They heard it before they saw it: sirens wailing, dogs barking, the rhythmic thump of distant explosions that grew closer with every strike. Mothers grabbed children. Workers dropped tools and sprinted toward shelters carved under apartment blocks or beneath public squares. Inside those cramped bunkers, the air tasted of lime and dust. Old men recalled their experience from the First World War trenches, but even they admitted this was a different kind of terror. Up above, the earth and sky exchanged fire. Flak guns hammering at the bombers, bombs tearing through roofs and streets. When the ground trembled, some prayed. Others whispered names of loved ones who never returned from the last raid. Each detonation could mean the loss of a home, a family, a future. And through the cracks in the shelter doors, those who dared to look saw flashes of silver, wings glinting against the heavens, so many that they seemed like a single unstoppable force. Civilians realized the truth. The war was reaching them, not on distant fronts, but at their very doorstep. The fear grew heavier with each passing day, because Germany could rebuild buildings, but it could not rebuild lives lost in the rubble. For American bomber crews, survival was never guaranteed. They climbed into their aircraft before dawn, fastening cold parachute straps, checking oxygen masks, loading ammunition into machine gun belts layer by layer. A final handshake, a photo tucked into a jacket pocket. Then engines roared and the airfields thundered with the weight of a nation at war. Inside the bombers, frost coated the aluminum walls. At altitude, temperatures plunged below -40 degrees Celsius. The airmen breathed through masks to stay alive, their hands stiffening around metal gun grips. Many frostbitten fingers never fully healed. They flew in formation, tight and rigid, because formation was life. Alone, a B-17 was prey. Together, they were a fortress. German fighters came fast and vicious, yellow-nosed FW-190s and Black Cross Bf-109s diving through flak bursts, cannons spitting fire. Each pass could rip open a bomber like paper. Even if they survived enemy fighters, the towering walls of flak over major cities waited ahead, a black storm of steel. Yet the crews pressed forward, knowing the cost of turning back. A failed mission meant the war lasted longer. More soldiers on the ground would die. More innocents in occupied Europe would suffer. Every mile earned in the sky was paid for in blood. And still they flew on. America's bombers represented engineering ambition forged into combat reality. The B-17 Flying Fortress, beloved by crews, was designed to resist death, redundant systems, armored cockpits, self-sealing fuel tanks. Stories spread of fortresses limping home with holes big enough to walk through, yet still landing wheels down. The Norden bombsight, guarded like a weapon more valuable than gold, promised accuracy within a handful of meters, enough to thread bombs into factories without flattening entire districts. Whether it always achieved that ideal was another matter, but belief in its precision shaped strategy. Armament bristled from the aircraft skins, tail guns, chin turrets, waist guns pumping out fire in every direction. Each bomber carried thousands of rounds, turning the sky into a spinning cage of bullets. And then came the difference maker, the P-51 Mustang. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and home again. Its arrival signaled a shift that Germany could not afford. Allied bombers were no longer vulnerable during their deepest strikes. Technology had shifted the balance. Machines now fought a war too vast to be stopped by courage alone. The sky was turning into a battlefield Germany could no longer dominate. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe stood unmatched in Europe. Its pilots were sharp, its fighters aggressive, its morale high. But by 1944, those glory days had faded into memory, replaced by exhaustion and impossible demands. Veteran pilots, the aces who carried experience from Spain, Poland, and France, were dying faster than new ones could be trained. The Luftwaffe flight schools shortened courses, sending barely prepared recruits into battle where survival was measured in minutes. Many never fired a single shot before being lost. Maintenance crews faced their own hell. Fuel supplies dwindled. Spare parts were scarce. Airfields were cratered by Allied fighter bombers. Even when planes were repaired, there wasn't enough aviation gasoline to keep them in the air. Commanders shouted for counterattacks. Hitler demanded the bombers be destroyed. But each interception drained the Luftwaffe further. Up above, the formations just kept coming larger every week. Soon, German pilots looked toward the silver sky with a grim understanding. They were no longer hunting. They were the hunted. And every loss made Germany more vulnerable than before. To defend its cities, Germany constructed colossal flak towers, reinforced concrete fortresses planted in Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna, and other strategic locations. Each tower mounted batteries of 105 mm or 128 mm anti-aircraft guns, spitting shells high into the air to burst among the bomber streams. Their walls were so thick that bombs often bounced off without piercing. Civilians crowded inside during raids, believing these structures to be unbreachable bastions. But even the towers could not cover everything. Industrial zones, railway yards, refineries, each needed its own defenses. Thousands of flak guns throughout the Reich created black clouds of steel fragments. Bomber crews called it Flak Alley, where one lucky hit could rip a wing from a fortress or send flames roaring through a fuel tank. Gunners worked until their ears bled, the concussive force of each blast hammering their bodies as they fired upward. Yet no matter how many shells they launched, the formation still advanced. The flak towers slowed destruction, but they could not stop it. Strategic bombing raised questions that still echo through history. Could the destruction of cities shorten the war? Did killing civilians ultimately save more lives? Leaders on both sides argued fiercely. Some insisted that total war demanded total effort. Every factory producing bullets was part of the battlefield. Every train carrying tanks counted as a target. But inside Germany, the consequences were lived by ordinary people. Families with no power over political decisions, children who did not choose this fight. Firestorms in Hamburg, flattened neighborhoods in Cologne, and burning ruins in Berlin showed a cost measured not only in craters but in broken generations. Airmen had their own turmoil. Not every target was clearly military. Briefings emphasized strategic value, but many crews returned haunted by what they had witnessed below. Flames spreading into homes, schools, hospitals. They believed they fought for a world without tyranny. Yet the path to peace was paved with unbearable sacrifice. These moral wounds would last far longer than any war. Early 1944. The turning point in the air war is about to unfold. Allied command had a clear objective: destroy the Luftwaffe. Not just weaken it, not disrupt it, eliminate it as an effective fighting force before the Allies launched their invasion of Western Europe. This campaign would be remembered as Big Week. February 20th to 25th, 1944. A relentless series of strikes against German aircraft factories, engine plants, and assembly lines. A Regensburg, a Schweinfurt, a Gotha, Augsburg, a Stuttgart, a Brunswick, Leipzig. Every day, the Americans sent deep penetration missions into the Reich. Every day, the bombers drew the Luftwaffe up into combat. And every day, the fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, hunted German interceptors with growing confidence. American bomber formations swelled in size until they filled entire quadrants of the sky. Crews in the lead elements could not see the end of their own armada. The roar of engines became a single, unbroken thunder that shook the air like a storm rolling over the earth. German cities stared in disbelief at the gleaming wave overhead. Silver aircraft, row upon row. Shadows passing across streets. Light glinting off thousands of wings. In the command bunkers below, German officers barked orders: scramble fighters, activate flak batteries, intercept at all costs. Radar screens flickered with swarms of approaching targets that seemed to multiply with each rotation. But the Luftwaffe had a new enemy: exhaustion. Veteran pilots climbed into cockpits with trembling hands. They launched knowing the odds had tilted against them. In the chaos above the clouds, formations shattered into dogfights. Contrails twisting into violent spirals as Mustangs slashed through the air. American fighters no longer turned back at the border. Now they followed the enemy home. They strafed airfields. They attacked planes as they tried to land. They denied Germany the chance to fight again tomorrow. Meanwhile, the bombers pressed toward their targets. Aircraft plants vital to Germany's future. At each objective, flak erupted into black storms. Shells burst close enough to leave shrapnel lodged in aluminum ribs. Crews watched as nearby fortresses fell away in flames or broke apart midair. But the formation never stopped. Bomb bay doors opened in synchronized motion. Bombardiers peered through Norden sights at factories below. Messerschmitt wings on the assembly line. Engine housings waiting for installation. Workers fleeing for cover as alarms blared. A few seconds of silence. Then the city convulsed. Explosions rolled like thunder across industrial districts. Machine shops burst into flame. Gantries collapsed. Production lines ground to a halt under piles of twisted steel. German commanders sent frantic reports to Berlin. Aircraft production was crippled. Training schools could not replace pilot losses. Fuel reserves were shrinking. And still, the Allies kept coming. On February 22nd and 23rd alone, more than 1,000 American bombers took to the skies over Germany each day. A scale of attack the world had never seen. Civilians called it Himmel voller Silber, a sky full of silver. Those on the ground could only watch powerless. They realized the enemy above was not a single raid, not a single bad day. It was a growing storm that would soon become permanent. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost 1/3 of its fighter force, and even more tragically, the trained pilots who could never be replaced. Germany had been forced into a battle it could not win, and America had proven it could fill the sky with fire at will. But the true breaking point, the moment the Germans collectively understood defeat was descending from above, was still to come. The silver sky would return, bigger than ever, and this time it would not relent. After Big Week, the change in the air war was undeniable. German commanders, pilots, and civilians alike understood one truth. The sky no longer belonged to the Reich. But the Americans were not finished. Through March and April 1944, as Allied ground forces secretly prepared for the Normandy invasion, the bomber offensive intensified to levels previously unimaginable. The raids grew in frequency, depth, and destructive power. And always, the bombers were accompanied by fighters that refused to let the Luftwaffe recover. The P-51 Mustang, now in full force, roamed far beyond bomber formations. Its pilots hunted German aircraft wherever they could find them, over cities, airfields, and even during takeoff. The Luftwaffe's backbone was not simply bent. It was breaking. Each day, more German pilots failed to return. Each new loss was a veteran with years of experience. Each replacement was a teenager with mere weeks of training. Meanwhile, the Americans launched operations so large that their size alone signaled the end of German air supremacy. Smoke rising from the previous day's ruins barely had time to clear before the next wave came. Then, one morning, the scale reached its peak. German civilians stepped outside to quiet streets. The air was strangely still. A faint vibration trembled through the ground. Children looked up. The horizon shimmered like sunlight reflecting off a silver sea. Then it grew, and kept growing. What they saw defied belief. More than 1,000 bombers, B-17s and B-24s, in multiple streams, 3 miles wide, stretching so far that even binoculars could not find the end. Thousands of engines fused into a single, rolling thunder that rattled window panes loose and shook dust from rafters. The sky turned silver, literal metal replacing blue. German flak batteries poured fire upward in desperation, black bursts punching into the formation. Yet for every bomber struck, dozens more pressed on unshaken, their shadows gliding over terrified neighborhoods. Luftwaffe units scrambled, but fewer and fewer planes lifted off the ground. Some pilots simply refused orders. Others never saw the bomber streams, they were intercepted first. Above nearly every major city, Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Leipzig, civilians witnessed the same unstoppable reality. Their once invincible Reich was now defenseless. Factories that fueled Hitler's war machine, ball-bearing plants, engine works, synthetic fuel refineries, erupted into flames. Storage tanks of aviation fuel detonated like volcanoes, boiling black smoke into the air. Railway yards crumpled under tons of explosives, choking supplies needed at the front. Amid the chaos, German leadership grew desperate. Speer warned Hitler that if fuel production continued to collapse, tanks, trucks, and planes would become useless metal. Without gasoline, the war could not move. Hitler raged, issued orders, and demanded counterstrikes. But his words could not conjure pilots back from the grave. American airmen felt the shift too. Missions that once ended in catastrophe now ended with bombers returning, most of them intact. The empty spaces in formations, once gaping holes where friends used to fly, became fewer and then no longer noticeable. Bomb groups assembled on British tarmac with confidence instead of dread. The air war had turned. And for Germany, there was no recovery. The Reich could build more guns, could build more planes, but it could not build more skies. The moment the Germans looked up and saw 1,000 silver wings blot out the sun, that was when many quietly realized defeat had arrived from above. When the bombers returned to their bases in England, ground crews counted the losses, 12 here, 20 there. Still painful, still heartbreaking. But for the first time since the start of the daylight bombing campaign, the numbers told a new story. The Americans were winning the air war. By the end of spring 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a dominant force. It was a scattered shadow of what it had once been. In mission reports, U.S. commanders increasingly noted opposition light, not because the Germans lacked anger or resolve, because they lacked airplanes, because they lacked fuel, because they lacked trained men to fight. The collapse of German aviation spread catastrophic effects through the entire war machine. Factories once buzzing with productivity fell silent beneath tons of rubble. Ball bearing shortages crippled tank and aircraft output. Destroyed power stations and transportation lines slowed everything. Repairs took weeks, then months, then became impossible. The shortage that hurt Hitler most came from above: fuel. Synthetic oil plants, once considered safe from large-scale attack, were now priority targets. By mid-1944, Allied raids had slashed production so severely that German tanks often sat immobile. Fighter squadrons stayed grounded to preserve precious gasoline for emergencies. Every blast of Allied bombs pressed Germany closer to paralysis. Civilian life descended into survival mode. Long lines formed around ration centers. Cities struggled to deliver clean water after pipeline breaks. The roar of engines overhead became a constant reminder that nowhere was safe, day or night. Propaganda tried to disguise the scale of the damage. Posters proclaimed, "We will fight to the last." Radio announcements insisted the Reich remain strong. But the German people knew what their eyes showed them. Factories burning, hospitals overflowing, children evacuated to the countryside so they might have a chance to live. A new fear grew in conversations whispered inside shelters. If the Allies can do this now, what will they do next? Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Allied air offensive brought confidence and certainty to the planning of Operation Overlord. Commanders like Eisenhower and Lee Mallory drew a direct conclusion. If German forces cannot move freely, if they cannot resupply troops, if they cannot reinforce coastal defenses, then the invasion can succeed. The air war had become the silent architect of victory on the ground. Still, Germany held one belief, that as long as its cities stood, there was hope. That if its will remained unbroken, the Reich might endure. Yet every day, more silver shadows darkened those cities. Mornings began with distant rumbling. Afternoons echoed with explosions. Nights revealed flames still burning where bombs had fallen hours earlier. Germany's leaders once imagined offensive domination of Europe. Now they struggled simply to survive the skies above their own homes. And the worst was still not over. By late 1944, the impact of the air campaign had become irreversible. What began as a strategy to weaken Germany from above had evolved into a systematic dismantling of its ability to fight at all. Entire industrial cities were reduced to landscapes of shells and craters. Workers navigated streets where landmark buildings were gone. Only piles of smoke-stained rubble showed where factories once stood. Power outages became routine. Rail networks collapsed under repeated bombing of switching yards and bridges. The German Air Ministry tracked production reports with mounting dread. Even when factories managed to resume output, the products could rarely reach front lines. Locomotives and freight cars sat twisted beside shattered tracks. From the east, the Red Army advanced across fields soaked with years of conflict. From the west, American, British, and Canadian armies pressed toward the Rhine. But both fronts were driven forward by the silent truth above them. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect Germany. Children learned to identify the sound of different aircraft. When bombers approached, schools emptied faster than alarms could sound. Teachers carried rosters into shelters and prayed to see every child again after the raid. Cities like Dresden, Essen, and Nuremberg, once symbols of German industry and culture, suffered fires so intense that heat warped steel beams. Residents dug through debris for survivors, listening for any faint cry under mountains of stone and dust. The Allied airmen, too, bore scars that numbers cannot show. There was pride in survival, but also a weight that lingered in silence. Many had watched bombs fall knowing that below were families just like their own. They justified it with necessity, to end tyranny, to stop the slaughter in occupied Europe, to save millions who suffered in concentration camps and under dictatorship. And yet, the images of burning cities did not fade easily. As 1945 dawned, the war in the air was no longer a contest. It was a conclusion. The Reich, once boasting dominance, was now defenseless under the silver tide. Every new raid was a message. Surrender was inevitable. Resistance only delayed more destruction. By the time American soldiers crossed into Germany on the ground, civilians lining the roads stared upward not in defiance, but in resignation. They knew the bombers that had thundered overhead for so long had already delivered the true defeat. The sky had spoken, and Germany's fall had begun long before its borders were breached. With the aftershocks of the air campaign spreading across every corner of the Reich, the war was entering its final and most tragic chapter. The question that remained was not if the Germans would lose, but how much more they would lose before accepting the unavoidable. Air power alone did not win World War II, but without it, the war could not have been won. The victory in the skies was built from sacrifice. Thousands of aircrews never made it home. Their planes vanished into clouds of flak, or fell burning into enemy territory. The losses were felt in every American town, every British village, every Allied nation that sent its young men to fight among the clouds. On the ground below, German civilians endured a nightmare not of their choosing. Many never supported the regime that led them into war. Families lost homes, loved ones, entire neighborhoods to raids they had no power to stop. Their suffering remains one of the war's heaviest burdens, a reminder that conflict always strikes hardest at those far from the decisions that start it. And yet, when standing against a regime that built death camps, that enslaved nations, that sought to extinguish entire peoples, stopping it rapidly became a moral imperative. The Allied bomber offensive, strengthened by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang, ensured the Nazi war machine could not continue its brutality indefinitely. It shattered the factories that armed German tyranny. It severed the supply lines that fueled invasion. It grounded the Luftwaffe, the shield that once made Hitler believe he was untouchable. By dominating the air, the Allies set the stage for liberation on the ground. So when the war finally ended in May 1945, the skies fell silent. No more sirens, no more firestorms, only relief and reflection. Today, the lessons remain clear. Air superiority is often the difference between victory and catastrophe. Technology and logistics can overpower even the fiercest ideology. A war, no matter how just the cause, leaves scars that last generations. The story of the bomber crews and their escorts is not just a chapter in history. It is a reminder of courage and the terrible cost of freedom. As we look back, we honor every soul touched by that struggle. Those who climbed into the sky to fight, those who endured on the ground below, those who never returned. History may record the strategies and statistics, but it is memory that preserves the humanity behind them. Because in the end, victory is never just about who wins the war. It is about what the world must remember to prevent the next one.